welcome. I'm Juan Carlos Gamarra, Ambassador of Peru to the United Kingdom, and continuing today with our series of Bicentennial Dialogues, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Alejandra Irigoin, who will give us a talk titled Constitutional Sin, Trade-offs between Representation and Taxation in Spanish America. Alejandra Irigoin is an associate professor and departmental tutor at the Department of Economic History of the London School of Economics and Political Science. She obtained a PhD in economic history at that same university with the dissertation Finance, Politics and Economics in Buenos Aires, 1820s, 1860s, the political economy of currency stabilization. Her research interests include early modern global economic and monetary history, economic history of Latin America, especially in the colonial period, and the comparative political economy of empires. She has also several publications, books, and articles on issues related to economic history. Thank you very much, Alejandra, for being with us today, and please, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you, Ambassador. It's a pleasure to be here with you and the colleagues from the Embassy. Thanks for the invitation. And as I said off the screen, these are very interesting and important times in our countries. So I've taken the liberty to organize my talk on the basis of my research, trying to bridge with the present situation, particularly in regards of dealing with COVID. So if you are all ready, I can start showing my tricks. This is apropos of the Bicentennial of the Peruvian independence, but on the main the issues and the topics I'm going to discuss, they are extensive. They can be extensive to the rest of Latin America. In general, in the historiography and in the popular mind, we've been trained and educated that there were huge benefits out of the independence or the revolution, and they were associated with the end of the fiscal and the commercial burden that the empire or the colonies bore from the Spanish rule. This was associated with the limitations to free trade, to the persistence of monopolies and privileges, and over time, and given the results, this optimistic view that the benefits from independence did not deliver a better or a prosperous present, historians have found that all these benefits have been offset by the cost of the independence, the cost, particularly the fiscal and financial cost of the independence war, which more precisely I would characterize as a civil war. And these wars were about the form of government and the form of the state that these new republics define and pursue after the end of the colonial or the Spanish rule. In addition, and that is my contribution to this research, I find that from that period, there is a legacy, which is here in red, that refers very much to the political economy of this modern states, or the states that emerged from the Spanish Empire. And these are features that have persisted throughout time. You know, in the 19th and 20th century, regardless of the changes these nations, republics, and economies have been through. And one is the inconsistency between representation and taxation, hence the title. And the other one is the asymmetry between the collection of taxes and the spending of public revenues. And that refers and builds, as the ambassador mentioned from my CV, from or arises from my research on the political economy of the Spanish Empire. And in my research, it comes out as a very different institutional setting that we were traditionally told. This empire was self-financed. Since the 16th century, continued expanding over the territory. By the 18th century, it was mostly financed by taxes on consumptions and trade. And the expansion of the empire, the incorporation of subjects, meant an expansion of the fiscal base. Now, these taxes were assessed, collected, and invested locally. There was a huge degree of local agency in the cities or even the small towns of the empire, because the fiscal functions of this empire was basically privatized or in the hands of the local authorities. Now, the distribution at the time was done through spending. There were public investment or subsidies to mining or to urban dwellers in providing food security. The colonial state was the largest employer aside of the mines, and that was done through the sale or purchase of administrative offices. The tobacco monopolies were large employers in the big cities where it was established, and the public goods like education and a good deal of welfare and health were provided by the church in the form of, under the form of a charity. There was nearly no construction or investment in public infrastructure or public works. And in comparison with other empires, the Spanish Empire in America and so did Spain in the metropolis, had a very low fiscal extraction that is suboptimal compared to the possibilities that, say, in comparison, the Netherlands or parliamentary England had. More interestingly, this colonial state is something like that we would be familiar with in the 20th century. It was a state that redistributed resources. We have and heard a lot about the extraction of the metropolis, the pillage, and the greed of the Spaniards that certainly were as greedy and venial like any human being. But the empire as a structure, it was not necessarily to exploit these territories. And not least because they were very, very rich. What you have in this table is for 3 different samples at the end of throughout the 18th century, the size of the value of the extraction to Spain from the whole of the empire. And this is measured in these gray blocks. You have the amount on top of the figure or the chart, and significantly, the proportion diminished, but because of the absolute values were very large, that meant for Spain a massive windfall. For Spain and Europe, and then to Asia. So to that extent, this is known. But what is interesting is what happened within the empire. And this is this red bars that count the amount of money that was redistributed within the empire. Transfers and remittances across colonies. That is money that remained in America for a while, eventually would end up traded for goods and manufactures and luxury things overseas, but it circulated first throughout Spanish America. So the proportion is very significant, and this redistribution of money, basically, and silver and resources dwarf any extraction, though important, that went to the metropolis. This created a very interesting dynamic in Spanish America. What you have there on the screen is the map where all the fiscal districts of the Spanish Empire in South America. There are some missing observations for Colombia in the chart, but these are basically the fiscal units of the empire, with different colors, different names, and so on. By the the second half of the 18th century, and from there, which is a little bit misleading because it's more important to look at the black dots. That these are the cities or the villages or the town where the authorities, the fiscal authority, were. The space within or in between was always not always occupied. Reflects that there is no obvious pre-existence of the nations as we know them now. Yeah, from this assortment of districts, 4 or 5 republics emerged in the first half of the 20th century. And the redistribution of resources, like the European Union these days, is very interesting when you compare the proportion. What you have there for the same districts in different grade or gradation of gray is a distinction of the sections of the empire that were net receivers or net payers into the system. The darker the section, the darker the territory, the larger the proportion of their revenues originated elsewhere in the empire. And it is not surprising then that the districts that host the capital cities, Montevideo, Buenos Aires, Santiago, Asunción, Potosí, and La Paz, but also Lima or Guayaquil at that time, were the largest recipients of these transfers. Yeah, and my argument and the paper I'm gonna discuss today is what happened when this system of redistribution imploded as a result of the events in Europe that deposed the Spanish king and left these territories without a legitimate ruler. To have a sense of how was this distribution, there you have for some of these districts, and I have highlighted the ones for Peru, the per capita proportion of that. And it's a little bit what I showed earlier. There were regions in Peru today that were net payers into the system. There were others, in that case Lima, that was a net recipient. And this is measured in per capita terms. So the transfers of resources between some regions, in that case to the capital, were very, very important. And the same happened in other places, as you see down in the table in Mexico, or in the case of Bolivia around Potosí, or in the River Plate around Buenos Aires. There were large winners in the system of redistribution that it worked while they were together. Out of the events in Europe and Spain, the first constitution and the first attempt to normalize the political situation, that is to grant legitimate authorities to Spain and Spanish America, emerged from what is called the Constitutional Courts of Cadiz in 1810. And there, a number of features and constitutional elements of what would be later on the constitution of the modern republics were somehow established. And there are some which are relevant for this talk. And this is that the taxation is removed away from the king and is passed to the body that represents the people or the Congress. The taxes were to be established in proportion of the faculties, which is a common formula of the time. They are very only in England at the time, and later in the United States there will be a distinction between direct and indirect taxes, or taxes on income or wealth. But in that constitutional chart, the idea was that taxpayers would pay in proportion of their faculties. The taxes were to be assessed by the local authorities. And something that is interesting, and I think it's very interesting because it has persisted, the chart established that the taxes would be proportional to the expenses, which is a little bit counterintuitive because you would think that the expenses would follow the taxes or the revenues, but it wasn't in the mind of these people. Now, with the independence and the revolution, obviously, the colonial taxation continued. There was no change whatsoever, despite all the political changes in the structure of taxation of these new lands, of these republics. The problem was how to aggregate these pieces, these districts, once the Spanish rule imploded in 1810, 1815, even 1820s. For the constitutional writers, the debt at the time, already in 1810, was paramount issue. They didn't think very much how to deal with that, but they acknowledge and recognize the debt, in that case from the colonial period, and they assigned to the people's representation, or the Congress, the prerogative to establish the value, the weight, and the fineness of the coin that was minted in Spanish America at the time. So during the Republican period, nothing changed very much, at least, for the good part of the 19th century. Taxes on trade were lower, hence this idea of the free trade, but the internal customs within these districts remained. Customs, or trade, taxes on foreign trade, became the main source of income for all the states. And the direct taxes of the time, the indigenous tribute mainly, whereas it was abolished initially in the wake of the revolution or the independence, they were quickly reinstated, particularly in the most populated regions or nations, and Peru is one of those. The problem was the aggregation of the parts, where they would become departamentos or provinces in the new republics. None of these new states developed a stable and prompt form of organization of a state. They oscillated from different forms of confederations, like the River Plate, to highly centralized forms of state, like Peru or Chile, or a failed federalism, like Mexico and in the 1820s. Whereas this form of state was in troubles or was difficult to establish, the incorporation with full rights, civil, political, and social rights of the subjects into citizens of these new republics was very generous and very wide. But these entitlements were mainly on paper. Buenos Aires had universal franchise for all male over 21. That was unseen in the rest of the world at the time. And the public provisions of private goods that there was a feature of the colonial period, continued, this time without the means. And what we have in the early 19th century is that the tax take of these states, it was even much lower per capita than what had been already during the colonial period. So we have the first tension of, granting entitlements without the means to provide for that. The first constitutional attempts, the first wave to organize the new state throughout Spanish America, in each of these countries, from the River Plate to Bolivia to Peru or Chile or Colombia after the disintegration of the Gran Colombia, the Republic of Gran Colombia, share these common characteristics. Freedom or independence was very costly. These governments were cash-starved, not least because this flow of money that had circulated within the empire ceased, but also because they disputed the power by military means. The military expenses were highly inelastic, that left all this government very much in debt. The colonial debt was recognized initially, and that was covered with the expropriation of the religious orders. Now, the religious orders were, apart from, ideologically the presence of the church, they were the financiers of this economy. There were no banks, there were no other financial intermediation, but the the religious orders. And in that circumstances, the means of finance the state were exhausted, and all these republics came to London, to the financial markets for external borrowing, and all of them defaulted their debt very early on and were cut off from the financial market for a good deal for a good part of the rest of the century. In these reforms, the first Republican reforms to establish, the basis of the state and the taxes and the new Republican organization, there were attempts to establish direct taxation. And in all these countries, these reforms failed. Yeah, it's famous, this failure of San Martin in 1821 government in Lima. All these republics ended up, increasing their trade taxes, and the dependence on foreign trade, the fiscal dependence was enlarged. And at the time that the internal customs, in the failure of aggregating the parts, persisted. So that created significant problems for the economy. This new state had very low fiscal capacity, and without means, without financial or fiscal means, the state capacity was very poor. The process is very different from the one in the United States or in Europe, where the aggregation of the parts make the big state. In Latin America, is the disaggregation of the parts that created the small republics. And there are very, very different effects in one and another part of the world because of the type of war that was waged. The civil war, no civil war, creates strong governments or strong states. The strong states, the modern state in Europe, emerged from the war, but they were external wars or considered external wars. So these governments were very weak from the beginning. They had no means. They had not even credibility to borrow, and the local domestic markets were very exhausted very soon. Hence the political instability that followed, yeah? And very similarly to what happened in 19th century Spain. And this is visible in the number of numerous constitutions that they wrote and they created for themselves. Now, out of this legacy, two interesting and even more persistent features continue. And one is the lack of identity between revenue and spending, as I mentioned for the Cadiz chart, and this other inconsistency between the provision of public goods. Yeah, in the colonial period and later in the Republican period, public goods such as education or health were provided privately, mainly by the church or the charities, the beneficencia, the societies of beneficencia that were established in all the big cities. And in the same way, there was a public provision of private goods, yeah? Employment, food security, subsidies, tax exemptions. These are all private goods that were provided by the state. And they were assumed by the people as entitlement, as right. So out of this double inconsistency or lack of identity, very significant, substantial problems persist for the constitutional architecture of Latin American republics. That is something that can be appraised or can be proxied by this median voter theorem. With the independence, the sovereignty of the King of Spain changed for the popular sovereignty, yeah? For the will of the people expressed in elections that appointed legitimate authorities. Now, in that system, in a majority rule voting system, the voter will vote, the closest to the median voter, that is the representation of the people, right? Is the sovereignty of the popular will. Now, this, which is a representative democracy, assumes the representations on the basis of direct taxes, so the contribution of the individual citizen taxpayer. Now, if the median voter has income that is lower than the mean or the average income, and that is, the case in Latin America then and now, given the high levels of inequality, the voter, the theoretical voter, would prefer to pay less taxes than he should, yeah, or lower taxes in relation to the public goods that receives, yeah, that is, in other words, is not invested in the polity or in the political constitution. So that is a very different theorem or rationale that you would get in a representative, fully representative democracy. But it's more so if the taxpayer, instead of paying direct taxes, pays indirect taxes without a voice in the decision of the rates, without a voice in the decision of how this money will be invested. And as it happens throughout the economic history of Latin America, the return from taxes go to service the debt, or they are eroded by inflation. Yeah. So what we have in a nutshell is the disassociation between the voter and the citizen taxpayer, this lack of identity, which I argue very significant consequences. With indirect taxes, the median voter, that is the one in the middle, the most frequent, yeah, will not mind paying, wouldn't mind receiving the benefit of public spending, yeah, because the public goods are afforded privately, that is, they are bought in the market, and the private goods are provided by the state. So in this disassociation or lack of identity between citizen or voter and taxpayer, we have this anomaly in which it's not in the interest of the taxpayer, or it's not invested in higher spending, because the market will provide for those that they can afford a number of public goods, and for the individual, the state will provide a number of private goods. Yeah, this is an asymmetry with significant political economic consequences, and I think that they are behind a little bit of the populism that we tend to see in the history of Latin America. So this inconsistencies is replicated in the lack of consistency between taxes or contribution and the entitlements, which is at the state of the or at the level of the state, is the same asymmetry between income and expenses. And I would argue that this asymmetry, this inconsistency, amplifies the inequalities. That is a way to identify where the median voter is, where the average or the mean voter is, and how the interest or utility function of the median voter that earns less than the average would be vested or invested to pay lower taxes because he can afford the public goods outside or through the market. And to wrap up and to conclude, why these asymmetries that they were present already at the beginning of the Republican period are important? Well, for one, is because this is a continuum, right? This is a persistence, an institutional persistence in all Latin American republics that started as a way to solve the political vacuum of the independence, that they were aggravated by the civil wars, that there were a characteristic that was shared with Spain until Spain actually joined the European Union in 1992, in which governments without means traded loyalty for entitlements and produced governments with very low fiscal capacity, or governments that couldn't build strong states. And strong state doesn't mean dictatorial or autocratic, but capable. And these governments or these new republics fought over resources and revenues, hence these long protracted civil wars. And all the freedoms obtained with independence, particularly the freedom to trade, was a mischaracterization, did not deliver prosperity because the internal markets remain fragmented and cut off by different internal barriers. So with weak governments that cannot tax, they don't have revenues with which to rule, and they have troubles to remain in power. And that explains the long 19th century instability, political instability in these countries until the golden age of the export-led growth of the globalization. Why this is a lingering constitutional sin? Why is a fundamental sin? Because these, the states, they have very low state and fiscal capacity. And this is rooted in the fiscal weakness. And that is something that we see in our republics today. That created political instability, but also jeopardized any spending, particularly for peace during peaceful times, because they have very low capacity to tax. The low taxation or a suboptimal taxation is a result of this paradox of the voter, the position in which the citizen taxpayer places him or herself in that constitutional setting, and led all these countries to eventually over-rely in the export of natural resources. Peru broke that circle of poor performance and misery and deprivation with a windfall of the guano export. It was the first of the Latin American countries that perceived the benefits of drawing resources, fiscal resources, from their natural resources. That has created states that no matter the changes, political, economic, globalization, either one or two, period of deglobalization, depressions and booms, remain, the states remain completely dependent on the fiscal return of their commodities exports. None of these countries, republics, with any kind of political regime, has been able to run or set counter-cyclical policies, and all these countries share this perverse trait of persistent inequality. They don't redistribute through taxes, but like in the colonial period, they redistribute through spending or investment. And that comes rooted in this idea that good government is a small government, and we are seeing now, and I think that Peru is a very, very sad example of the problems of the lack of capacity of the state. Peru, at the moment, is the Latin American country that has spent more money in comparison to the rest to allocate financial assistance to the individual or household. About 2.8 million Peruvian households are entitled to receive financial assistance from the state of the government in the context of the COVID. And yet, this very best, very well-intended policy is not reaching the beneficiaries. And that is not something that you can attribute to a government or the people themselves. There is something rooted in this poor fiscal and state capacity that, in these circumstances, is prejudicing the efficiency of the welfare that the governments want to put in place to deal with COVID-19. So I think that it's worth looking at these issues of taxation and representation, that they are embedded and ingrained in the constitution of our countries, and look at these constitutional problems with different eyes, and eventually find another way to deal with taxation and representation. That is so far what I have the lessons that I can draw from the independence. which
well, Alejandra, I want to thank you so much for sharing with us your very important work on this subject, which I am sure has encouraged or will encourage many of our followers to deepen and read about all these consequences that we are living in modern times that started or that originate in our colonial and independent states. Thank you very much, Alejandra.
Thank you, Ambassador. I hope that is something that other scholars can think of and make the best efforts, or the best of the best efforts of our governments to come to fruition at a moment in which there are so difficult times for the people.
Thank you very much.